in Washington, D.C. Given what they are doing now, or trying to do now, what should they do now? And the third of those questions, I think, is the most interesting and the most difficult to answer. There's a lot of talk in the popular press, writing on Taiwan about the need for kind of high-profile weapons systems, so submarines, F-35s, and other kind of fancy toys, basically, for the military. And given the budget strains that Taiwan faces, the budget constraints that Taiwan faces, there is, I think, an important and open question about whether those are the most effective use of Taiwan's resources in responding to this challenge across the strait. And so, to set the stage for our speaker then, I'm really happy that we were able to get Mike Chase here, because he's one of the foremost experts on this question. He joins us from the Pardee Rand Graduate School. So other side of the country, flew out yesterday. Don't think you're jet lagged.
No, I'm okay. So far,
so far.
I was in San Francisco. I was in Santa Monica and Monterey last week, so
okay,
I may still be jet lagged from that, so I'm still okay.
You're still on West Coast time. Great. He is also a senior, so he's a senior political scientist at Rand, professor at the Pardee Rand School in Washington, D.C., and he's an adjunct professor in China Studies and Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS for short. He's a specialist in China and Asia-Pacific security issues. Previously a professor at the U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island. He served as the Strategic Deterrence, Director of the Strategic Deterrence Group in the Warfare Analysis and Research Department. And he, prior to that, was a research analyst at the Defense Group Incorporated and a policy analyst at RAND. So he has a long history with RAND. And most pertinent to this talk, he is the author of the book Taiwan Security Policy, and also numerous chapters and articles on China and Asia-Pacific and Taiwan security issues. His current research focuses on Chinese military modernization, China's nuclear policy and strategy and nuclear force modernization, Taiwan's defense policy, and Asia-Pacific security issues. He holds a PhD and MA from SAIS and a BA in politics from Brandeis. And in addition, he spent some time studying Chinese at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in Nanjing, China. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Mike.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks also for... thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad I could make it out on on a little bit of short notice, but it's it's an important and timely subject, and there are not really very many places in the U.S. where people are paying as much attention to Taiwan as they should be, and this is certainly one of them. So I'm excited to be here for that reason. I guess I should put out the kind of standard disclaimer that I'm speaking about my own views and my own work. I may reference some RAND research at several points in the discussion, but I'm not speaking on behalf of RAND. I'm here on my my own capacity today, so I'm not representing the views of RAND or any of its U.S. government or other sponsors. I also will probably say some things that will come across as critical, perhaps sharply so, of aspects of the Trump administration's policies. And so please bear in mind, RAND is totally nonpartisan, but my own views will become apparent even if I try to tone them down a little bit. So, but I want to just kind of start out by saying my main focus today is really going to be Taiwan's defense policy under President Tsai. But to kind of understand where Taiwan is now and the challenges that Taiwan currently faces, I think for context, we have to go back and think a little bit about the security environment that Taiwan faced under Presidents Lee and Chun and Ma, and how Taiwan has kind of adjusted in response over time. As Karis pointed out, the response has not really been by ramping up defense spending, but certainly there have been other changes, and I think there have been changes in terms of the way that a lot of strategists in Taiwan think about responding to the challenge that Chinese military modernization poses. There have been certainly changes in Taiwan's overall approach to its sort of national security policy, more broadly defined, and so we can get into some of that as well. But if you go back to, say, the mid-1990s, I think is about the right jumping off point for this discussion. And in fact, I would suggest that we start with the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. And I think there are a couple of reasons why that's important. Obviously, Taiwan's democratization from a PRC, from Beijing's point of view, poses some challenges in how they manage the cross-strait relationship, because they're no longer just dealing with the head of an authoritarian government. They're not dealing with the head of a Leninist party, which they sort of know a lot about doing, being that they are, of course, a Leninist party themselves. And that created a whole set of challenges that they were not accustomed to dealing with in the cross-strait relationship. And so the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, though, as well as remembered really for the Chinese missile launches and the military exercises that were intended to intimidate politicians and voters in Taiwan, and I think also to send a message to the United States. What a lot of people don't really remember is that at the time, the Chinese military, People's Liberation Army, could not really present a lot of options to Chinese Communist Party leaders. Because in the mid-1990s, the PLA was kind of emerging from the sort of the shadow of the Tienanmen crackdown. They had started to receive some increases in their budget, but there was also a lot of inflation, so those were not as impressive as the real increases that they've enjoyed year on year since then. The PLA of the kind of early to mid-1990s was still excessively large. Had a lot of outdated equipment, was relatively poorly trained, and had few real options for using force against Taiwan. So they couldn't really execute a blockade. They certainly couldn't have conducted an invasion at that point in time. What they could do was to kind of mount a fairly impressive sort of demonstration of force to try to intimidate Taiwan. But beyond that, they didn't really have a lot of options to offer to Communist Party leaders had leaders in Beijing requested them. So the threat environment that Taiwan faced was very different. And of course, obviously, even then, the size of the PLA was going to dwarf anything that Taiwan could do with its military. So quantitatively, there was certainly a large advantage for China. But qualitatively, in the mid-1990s, Taiwan really still had some pretty strong advantages. They had much better trained, more highly educated personnel. They had qualitative edges in terms of some of the weapon systems. And I think most people who worked on kind of net assessment type issues at that point thought that while things were probably about to start going in kind of a negative direction for Taiwan, Taiwan actually was in a relatively solid position in terms of the the professionalism, the training, the education, and the technological level of technology of some of their capabilities compared to the much larger, but again, relatively poorly trained and not particularly well equipped yet Chinese military. So was there a question?
No, can you speak louder?
Oh, sure, of course. Okay, I can try. So that was kind of the cross-strait balance of military power in the mid-1990s. And a lot has really changed since then. So what happened was, as Karis pointed out in his introduction, we started to see these annual increases of 10% or so on average in real terms in the mainland China's defense budget. So the People's Liberation Army started to finally receive the big increases in defense spending that it had wanted for a long time, but that had been deferred because of the priority that China attached to economic development, and because they didn't want defense spending to kind of crowd out other areas that they were investing in. By the mid-1990s, they were able to start to provide these sustained annual increases in defense spending to the PLA. They were also on about the second or so round of a major reorganization and downsizing of the PLA that was supposed to make it kind of leaner and meaner. And we're also making great progress in terms of how they organized and managed their defense industry, so that ultimately, the goal was that they would become less reliant on importing weapons from Russia and better able to domestically produce advanced capabilities for the Chinese military. In the late 1990s, they actually had a big reorganization of the defense industry. So not just pumping more money into it, but trying to really put the PLA in charge of the requirements process and to make sure that they could get out of the defense industry what they really wanted. instead of a process in which the defense industry kind of used its bureaucratic weight and influence to produce what it felt like producing, and the PLA got that whether they liked it or not. So there were some important changes going on in this period just after the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. And then through the Chun years and into the Ma years, and very much now under President Tsai, we just see a much more capable Chinese military for Taiwan to contend with. So it's not just that they've thrown a lot more money at this problem, which they have, and the rate of increase in defense spending is starting to level off. And that's because I think, again, on the mainland side, they are being very careful to make sure that defense spending doesn't impose undue burdens on the economy. There are lots of scholars in China who have studied the collapse of the Soviet Union and think that one of the reasons for the collapse was that the United States sort of induced the Soviet Union into a arms competition that it couldn't really afford to sustain over time. And so I do think that we'll probably see not so much anymore the 10 or 12 or 14% real increases year on year in Chinese defense spending. Maybe lower numbers like we've seen for the past year or two. Maybe that will say that it levels off at 5% a year increase even. That's still it's a big defense budget at this point, and another 5% every year is a lot. It's a lot of money. So what we're really seeing now is the PLA focusing not just on spending more, but really focusing more on trying to increase its level of readiness, becoming more capable of conducting joint operations that are very information intensive. They've modified, again, recently their military strategy to focus more on sort of information-centric operations. And the Chinese military right now is in about the second year of probably its most sweeping reorganization, at least since the immediate sort of post-Chinese Civil War period, where they're really trying to make it much more focused on warfighting and power projection and joint military operations. So, we've gone through this period where at the beginning of this, roughly 20 years or so that I'm talking about, the Taiwan's armed forces still had kind of a decent qualitative edge in terms of their preparedness and personnel and so on. And now they face a much more professional, much better equipped, much more well-trained Chinese military. I say Chinese better equipped and well-trained relative to where the PLA was earlier. Taiwan actually still has a very professional, very well-trained military, but they're not really able to count on any sort of qualitative advantage anymore because the Chinese military has now focused a lot on education and training and trying to be more optimally organized for the kinds of operations they think they might need to conduct. So it's just a completely different type of military challenge for Taiwan. Now, under President Chun, I was a PhD student at SAIS, and my dissertation focused on what to me seemed like a kind of interesting puzzle, which was partially, why is Taiwan not really ramping up its defense spending in response to what China is doing, but it was also, kind of why is it that President Chun has sort of an overall national security strategy that was, quite aggravating to China. I mean, you could argue about whether fairly so or not, but that was certainly how China responded to it. And at the same time, while his government tried to cultivate strong support in the United States, also faced some challenges because there were aspects of his approach to China that were also alienating some policymakers in the U.S. who really felt that some of what President Chun was doing, while it maybe made sense for him politically at home, was kind of running unnecessary risks of drawing the U.S. into a crisis across the Taiwan Strait. So that was an interesting puzzle to me, and I took a look at Taiwan's security policy under President Chun, and it seemed to me that there were several important factors. I mean, first of all, I think there was a sense among some people in the U.S. that Taiwan, quote, didn't take the threat seriously or wasn't serious about its own defense. Okay, I found that to be false and just an unfair characterization of what was going on in Taiwan. I think people took the threat seriously in terms of, analysts in Taiwan clearly recognized the improvements in Chinese military capabilities that were going on. They may have had some doubts about how willing China really was to use force to resolve the Taiwan issue, or whether anything that President Chun did might have really triggered a severe crisis. But they certainly appreciated the increases in Chinese military capability. There's no question about that. And My impression was that Taiwan was actually, quite serious about its defense.